Good morning and welcome to another nonprofit forum. Today we will be discussing disrupting fundraising and centering equity with April Walker. Before we jump into that, we have a couple of things to discuss this morning. First off, to find live captioning, go ahead and look at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. There will be a button there that says show captions. If you click there, they should pop right up on your screen. If you need to adjust, you can use the caret right there on the button. Also, this webinar is being recorded. And that means that you will have access to this webinar after it's over. It will be posted to YouTube in about a week and sent out to the email inbox that you use to register. If you have questions for the speaker today, please go ahead and leave those questions in the question and answer box, the Q&A box. Keep an eye on that box throughout the forum. And if you see any questions in there that you would like to hear answered, go ahead and upvote those questions, or you can add your own. That'll help me know what questions to ask during the Q&A section. If you have difficulties during the forum, technical issues, please go ahead and leave those in the chat box. They will be monitored by a staff member. At the end of the forum, if you stick around for a few seconds, you'll see a survey pop up on your screen. Please go ahead and fill that survey out for us. It helps us know how we're doing and what content you would like to see coming up. Before we introduce April today, I wanted to take a few additional seconds to say goodbye to Tori. Tori is the other half of our two-person nonprofit forum team, and she has served with us for about 2 years as a logistics manager, managing all of the details leading up to the event, all the behind-the-scenes elements that make our forums great and make them run smoothly. And today is Tori's last day serving in this capacity. She'll be moving on to new work. Tori, will you take a couple seconds just to tell us about your work?
Hi, everyone. I'm Tori. I've been the Oz behind the curtain for the past few years, and just wanted to say thank you to Danielle for running such seamless events, and to our wonderful presenters and panelists that I've learned so much from, and our faithful audience who's been with us through Zoom hiccups and learning curves. So just thank you to everyone who makes these possible. So yeah, like Danielle said, I will be transitioning to a new role within the Columbus Foundation at our Center for Human Kindness. So I will be working to promote community flourishing and well-being in Columbus through events like the Big Table and other activations, and working with our climate equity grant making and our environmental grant making. So very excited for that. That'll be starting in May. So like Danielle said, this is my last time running the back end of the show. So it has been an honor, and I will continue to be cheering you all on, and most likely watching from a participant mode in the future. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Tori. You know, you had a lot to do with these running smoothly. And so, we really appreciate the work that you've put in. You and I really built this process together, and I am very grateful for all the work you've put in. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Back to the show. Bye, everyone.
Back to the show. All right, next, let's hear about April. April is a nonprofit and foundation consultant, an equity champion, and a writer. Her decade-long career in philanthropy spans grant-making, fundraising, and consulting roles at numerous organizations, including the American Heart Association, Boys and Girls Club of Chicago, and CCS Fundraising, just to name a few. April previously worked as a chief development officer for a workforce development nonprofit in Cleveland, Ohio, where she led a $10 million capital campaign, raising $3.2 million in 18 months. In 2021, April founded Philanthropy for the People, an equity-centered consulting firm that equips donors, foundations, and nonprofits to embrace philanthropy that centers racial equity and social justice. April, I am excited to hear from you today. Let's get started.
Very happy to be here. Thank you so much, Danielle, and hello to everyone. I'm happy to be joining you. I hope you were all somewhere cozy on this Tuesday morning with your coffee or water. You may see me drink some water throughout as I'm getting over some type of situation, so do bear with me. Also, if you are tuning in from Ohio, which I assume many or most of us are, you will see that winter has returned for some odd reason. So I am sending warm sunshine, spring vibes to all while we navigate the flurries and snow currently happening outside of my window up here in Cleveland. Thanks again, Danielle, for that very kind introduction and the invitation to lead this forum on my favorite topics, disrupting philanthropy and centering equity. Also want to say kudos as well to Tori, job well done for bringing these forums to life. I'm glad I get to be part of your legacy in some very, very small way. So let's go ahead and jump in. So we're going to start by reviewing our agenda for the day. To start, I'm going to share a bit more about what brings me to this moment. Specifically, my background and the work of my firm. Next, we're going to talk about the current fundraising landscape, the good, the bad, the curious. And then we're going to talk a bit about why and what we might want to disrupt. Disruption, by definition, means radical change to an existing industry due to an innovation. So in this case, the innovation of sorts is equity. So we are honing in there specifically. Next, we're going to talk a bit about why disruption is even necessary, what we mean by centering equity, and what could that look like in our day-to-day instead of in the abstract or overall. We're going to explore some actionable things and some larger strategic initiatives as well. Last but not least, we'll be able to see Danielle's lovely face again as she hops on to help lead us through the Q&A. As mentioned, please pop in your questions throughout. All questions are welcome. Big questions, small questions, challenging questions. I look forward to hearing from you. So a bit more about me. I am absolutely a social worker by academic training, having earned an MSW at the University of Chicago. My entire career, as mentioned, has been in or adjacent to philanthropy in some way. While I do have a certificate in DEI from Cornell, I fancy and strongly believe that lived experience, a penchant for radical truth-telling, and a commitment to growing even, or perhaps especially when that growth makes me uncomfortable, is the root of my work as an equity strategist. Most important, I am born and raised in Baltimore, though I've called the Midwest home for the past 10 years or so. Philanthropy at the time played a big role in my life, even though I did not have language or an understanding of it, having afforded me the opportunity through myriad scholarships to attend college preparatory and independent schools that set me up on a path to success, but certainly was not without challenges for any young Black girl navigating predominantly white educational environments. Above all, and this point is not up for debate, I am the proud aunt of the cutest 8-year-old boy in the world. That is a fact, not a feeling. His name is August, and so we have a whole month vibe going there. Always have to give an honorable mention to my inspiration. A bit more about my firm. As mentioned, I launched this business in 2021 when it became clear that there was not space for me to show up as my full self inside of a singular nonprofit, but especially inside of a nonprofit where I was the only person of color on the leadership team of a predominantly Black serving organization. That full self for me is one that celebrates Black joy and liberation, and again, embraces radical truth-telling. And there just was not space. Those things were at odds when I was an in-house fundraising professional. And so I ventured out on my own. I've had the pleasure of partnering with myriad nonprofits and foundations, including those that you see on the screen, centering my work around equity intentionally, not only because it's the bridge between diversity and inclusion, but also because I think it's one of the most misunderstood terms in all of our DEI lingo. Very high level, diversity is essentially a numbers game. It's another way of asking about who's represented, which voices, affiliations, lived experiences, socioeconomic statuses are physically present, what is the demographic makeup and who's accounted for. Inclusion is the outcome of much of this work. It's the resulting experience of working to diversify and operationalizing equity. So we'll look at some definitions a bit later to highlight the ways we misunderstand and potentially misapply DEI terms, but I wanted to offer that as a very high level starting point. Next up, because I don't exist in this work alone, and I don't believe that you do either, I'd like to start us off with a grounding quotation. If you don't know or follow Adrienne Maree Brown, I highly recommend you get familiar. She is an incredible writer whose work focuses on transformative justice and emergent strategy. This quote, I believe, is a timely one, especially when talking about disruption, because I want, and quite frankly need, to disavow us of the notion that we're stuck with a binary. If you're tuned in, then I assume you agree that there's some problematic and harmful realities about fundraising and maybe philanthropy overall, approaches to how we do this work, power imbalances, etc. As a result, it's quite easy and tempting to want to burn the entire system down. And please do not misunderstand me moving forward. I'm largely an advocate for that as well. But in the meantime, if and until we get there, the question really is, how can we push towards something that is better, more equitable, and more accessible with what we have? Adrienne provides an excellent framework for this. She says, you are always practicing something. You are either practicing upholding the world as it is, or you are practicing shifting into the world you want it to be. In this case, for those of us here today, that world is that of fundraising and philanthropy, and the practice is that of disrupting what is widely accepted as the only way to do business. Speaking of how we do business, let's dig in at a very high level to, again, the system or world we're referring to. So on the screen, you'll see what I would refer to as largely some traditional fundraising strategies. In this case, these are all, or some, not all, it's not comprehensive, of the mechanics that nonprofit development teams focus on: convening or partnering with the development committee of the board of directors, planning an annual event or events, direct mail campaign or campaigns, publishing an annual report, cultivating relationships with major donors. I'm in a practice and habit of keeping major in quotation marks because there is much to be said about the undue influence and special treatment those with the ability to give larger philanthropic contributions receive. That is a forum for another day. Nonetheless, some of our work also includes offering naming rights, navigating capital campaigns, and the like, which of itself in and of itself on the surface is not problematic. Many of these tools are tried and true. It's the structure we've inherited as fundraising professionals, but there are some concerns. Starting with, if you see the graphic over here on the right, you'll see what is probably a very standard approach to structuring a nonprofit development team. You have your board, your executive director, and then your development director, very hierarchical in nature. It strikes me though, and I hope it strikes you as well, that some folks, some communities are missing entirely from this. Namely, within the development piece, you'll see there is a ping over here for community affairs. That, however, is not standard. And I can't find a number on the number of nonprofit organizations with full community engagement teams or liaisons. I suspect I've seen an increase in recent years, but it cannot be certain. It's not being tracked. So I can't account for that or the way that community engagement may show up inside of some other development job descriptions. But I do believe, and I'm somewhat hopeful, that there has been an uptick, but there is not accurate data as of yet. Nonetheless, even in the presence of really dedicated staff and even a board and an ED that's engaged, the culture of the current fundraising structure is not one that integrates, mandates, requires, or even suggests that people being served and the communities benefiting from the nonprofit's mission should be consulted or even centered in how nonprofits approach their work. Considering the oversaturation of nonprofit board members, so at this level up here, from the legal and financial or wealth management background, we are missing many valuable perspectives and contributions from grassroots and grasstops leaders that are much closer to the work at hand. A bit more about what is concerning about fundraising as we know it, as we have inherited it, relates to how the operations and the results of this work are deeply steeped in inequity. So for example, the administrative cost of a grant is often more than the amount awarded to the organization due to a number of factors. Many of you on this call may know very well the strife of coming up with fake funder budgets and the like, just to receive some level of support, perhaps support that is even restricted to a specific program, money that's already spent before you even get it in the door. Nonetheless, that 46% figure that you see on the screen, it's inclusive of all costs, which does include the cost of salaries to pay either a consultant or a contractor or an in-house grant writer for time spent working on the proposal, identifying potential foundations to reach out to, and the requirements post-grant award, which often include various other staff members from the program team, et cetera. So similarly, despite myriad nonprofits employing the same fundraising mechanics that we previously mentioned, the outcomes are vastly different. So unrestricted funding for Black-led nonprofit organizations is 76% less than what is received for their white-led peers, which is just a deeply troubling and concerning number. The same is actually true for the endowments of Black-led organizations, and we can apply that to our own lives. If you have a robust savings account or a trust, or some sort of monies that were inherited, your security, your sustainability, your ability to innovate and embrace abundance is much different from those that struggle to make payroll and have other issues navigating the day-to-day operations to keep the lights on and the copier filled with paper. So the mechanics applied to this work, even when applied in the same way, result in deeply disparate and inequitable fundraising outcomes, which from my perspective would merit that we do something about it. Another quick point I want to mention is the high cost of losing high-performing fundraising professionals. The amount of turnover that nonprofits continue to navigate as it relates to development directors is deeply troublesome. I am certainly someone that left my role as an in-house chief development officer after only 2 years, again, for myriad reasons. I was with a client at an event yesterday, and I was speaking with someone in the audience, and she asked me, why do development officers switch around so much? And I gave her a very honest and transparent answer. But it's worth noting that these changes are definitely evident to those that we are stewarding and cultivating relationships with often, those that land on your top 50 or top 25 list of prospects because they have the propensity to give or a certain amount of assets that make them ideally a potential donor for just about everyone. Another way to look at this per the chart is that about 33% of development directors stay for 2 years, and about 19% stay for less than a year. So we're talking about more than half of development officers, development directors, managers, whatever the top position is inside of the organization, staying in their role for just about 24 months or less. So that would suggest that something isn't working, right? In work built on relationships, and preferably relationships that are not transactional, this is not entirely sustainable. You can ask anyone seeking to hire a development director right now. And especially as it relates to community engagement, it's difficult to build community where you have a revolving door. So while a nonprofit may have a physical presence in a community or in a neighborhood, it does not mean that they exist as a trusted ally, an actionable ally or partner. It requires people who are invested to maintain those bridges, to maintain that communication, to maintain that transparency. And rebuilding bridges, starting over from scratch, is very costly from a trust standpoint every 2 years or so. So if you're like me and you are bit with the bug that makes you want to shake things up and or identify as a professional troublemaker while trying to do good, hopefully you'll agree that we might want to change some things based on the past few slides. Know that we're not alone. Some of our fellow disruptors are up on the screen. You may be familiar, but in the case that you are not, so we have Trust-Based Philanthropy, which, if you don't know, they're a peer-to-peer funder initiative that works to address the inherent power imbalances between foundations and nonprofits. We also have our friends over at Community-Centric Fundraising, which is a movement to re-examine philanthropy and fundraising philosophy to transform it so that both are co-grounded in racial and economic justice explicitly. We have the Philanthropy Initiative for Racial Equity, whose work focuses on increasing the amount and effectiveness of resources aimed at combating racism. Their report, Mismatched, is fascinating and disheartening as a read, but it does correct the distorted picture of the assumptions about philanthropy, specifically in 2020, and then also the 10 years prior. Last but not least, we have Cause Effective, and they released a very important report that lays out many examples of how the field of fundraising, especially for folks of color, does harm to the individual and to the system itself. So all serve as evidence that our current approach needs some shifts, some catching up, some change, some disruption. We've really yet to reach a tipping point, but that is why we are here today. All right, so to center equity, we really have to agree and understand what it is. And as mentioned previously, the DEI field, and God bless myself and my fellow practitioners, is really overloaded with jargon and doublespeak. One of my favorite activities to do is to ask people to define each of these terms distinctly, and the responses are incredibly consistent. Not necessarily in their accuracy, but in their unvaried nature. People define equity as access, people define inclusion as diversity, and so on and so forth. Nonetheless, most commonly, the definition of the screen on equity is one that is certainly widely accepted: equity as the condition when you can no longer predict advantage or disadvantage based on race, gender, ability, sexual orientation, and the like. Which is a fine way to articulate what we are striving towards, but I imagine that you would agree, it doesn't lend itself much to telling us what we should do or how we should actually get to that said condition. Thus, and keep in mind, I would love to live in a world where we have myriad examples of race and ethnicity and gender not determining outcomes. If you live there, do invite me, I will show up. But in the meantime, because I don't know where that exists, the definition on the screen offers a definition from a different vantage point, one that's rooted in action and not in the outcome that, again, doesn't exist many places. So this defines equity as sharing resources and decision-making power in a way that fundamentally supports the self-determination of all people, and especially communities of color. So it starts with a verb, which is sharing, much more actionable. I do want to emphasize quickly that especially on communities of color, is because of my particular work on racial equity, and the reality that at any intersection of race, gender, sexual orientation, et cetera, the darker your skin color, the worse the outcomes become. However, for the purposes of your nonprofit's work, you may need or delight in amending that anti-Blackness and overlapping systems of oppression, again, is another forum, but just wanted to offer a bit of clarity there. Another one of my favorite authors, actually, besides Adrienne Maree Brown, his name is Kiesi Layman. He's a current MacArthur Fellow. He describes equity as an honest assessment of what has been given to certain people and what should have been given to others. So essentially looking at the distribution and moving in such a way that helps to equalize those resources. So sharing is going to be the name of the game. It requires that you acknowledge what you have, even for nonprofits that do feel bootstrapped, et cetera. There are certainly assets that we have, and they are diverse depending on the size of your development team, the budget of your events, the access you have to communities that are not proximate to your mission, communications and marketing staff, budgets to engage mail houses, data about your programs, et cetera. Centering equity then overall becomes a question about how we share our resources and our decision-making power. So we're going to start with decision-making power. Making the case for sharing that is quite easy, in part because of the percentages up on the screen. And let's ground ourselves in this data to move forward. We have that 79% of nonprofit board chairs and executive directors are non-Latinx white. So essentially, we have about 80% of those in the field being represented in the nonprofit sector, being led by either a white man or a white woman, which in and of itself is not entirely problematic, but it is problematic if you don't have a foundation of inclusion, equity, and community engagement. We also have 16% of all white boards governing nonprofits that focus on serving people of color. I love to draw the analogy, and I hope someone shuts me up at some point, of an all-Black board governing a country club. You don't see the opposite. And so this is certainly cause for concern, and it should cause us to pause. Both of these things contribute to pay equity and discrimination. There's much more to be said about that, but for the sake of time, I would encourage folks to look up an article in the Chronicle of Philanthropy on Ann Price. She was working at the Insight Center for Community and Economic Development, and her story is fascinating, but really highlights the way that Black leadership struggles inside of nonprofit organizations where the board is racially homogenous. So that said, we all do have work to do, but we cannot be doing that work if we're making certain decisions in a vacuum. If you're asking or thinking to yourself, but isn't that what our board and our leadership team is for? That's a fair sentiment to have. But unfortunately, it's entirely at odds with operationalizing equity. What is top-down, exclusive, and obscure decision-making is not going to be effective in the long term for solving some of the problems at hand. So this can be applied in terms of sharing decision-making power organization-wide, but fundraisers and development teams would be one of the main primary beneficiaries of this, because you'd be raising money for something around which there is a greater level of excitement and buy-in. And you'd be innovating not only for the sake of telling a foundation that you're trying something new or scaling a program, but rather because you're really committed to achieving the outcomes of the community and the people served that they themselves are seeking. So it's starting with them, not getting to them as an afterthought or in a survey on the other side of your program or service provision. So specifically to share some of this decision-making power, which I do not purport is easy, but I have seen various levels of success with taking this approach, you need to start by laying out your current decision-making structure. This will make your hierarchy very transparent. It may be top-down from the board. There may be pockets of power in other arms of the nonprofit, but that transparency is really essential, especially in the absence of diversity or representation. Many organizations exclude intentionally or unintentionally those that are closest to the work, and as a result are reproducing inequities. So you can then create a work plan around who you will get input from and at what level and how often they are invited to support this decision-making, various decision-makings, what kinds of decisions they can support. Distributing decision-making throughout the organization and inclusive of community creates more leaders, which is indeed what we want. There is a cycle in which nonprofits will consult or seek feedback and then still go the way they previously intended or the leadership team and board previously intended. So the process of polling people with an affect of not actually being open to change or hearing what the community is asking for, which may require a significant shift, has a negative impact. So certainly work to avoid that. Rooting us in another quote quickly before we talk about sharing resources. This is Brian Stevenson, who, if you don't know him and you haven't seen the movie Just Mercy, that would explain everything much better than I can in this short few seconds, but he's a lawyer, a social justice activist, and he founded an organization based in Alabama called the Equal Justice Initiative. And Brian's entire theory of change and impact is really rooted in getting proximate. So he says we must get proximate to suffering and understand nuanced experiences of those who suffer from and experience inequality. If you are willing to get closer to people who are suffering, you will find the power to change the world. Many nonprofits, again, are quite removed from the communities that they are serving, just replicating their service model year over year without actually taking a moment with the community to ask at a high level, is this what you want? Is this what you need? Are we the right people to do this work? When it comes to sharing resources, this requires a pretty significant mindset shift, and community-centric fundraising offers us a pretty helpful starting point to think about the resources that we do have. So one CCF principle is that nonprofits are generous with and mutually supportive of one another. In work with many of my clients, we identify ways to partner with smaller organizations that are aligned with the mission. So an example, I work with a mid-sized, depending on the landscape of nonprofits that you have, organization in California, have a budget between $6 and $8 million a year. And every year, since we've been partnered. They identify an opportunity at their annual event, which is hosted at a beautiful venue that has a very high price tag, to donate the proceeds of some effort to one of their legal aid partners, right? So a legal aid organization that does not have the capacity, the bandwidth, the infrastructure to even rent that venue, or perhaps even the audience to attend that type of fundraising event, but they make sure to highlight that organization's work inside of what they're doing. Getting to this point requires us to think about our own generosity as fundraisers, as nonprofits. It's deeply beneficial as well from a fundraising perspective because it expands your own reach and network, though that's not what many of us are taught. Again, all of this is rooted in the idea of centering the people and the communities being served and repositioning ourselves, not entirely as the experts to solve a thing, but as people that are lending voice and platforms and resources to the communities that we want to see have better outcomes. So over here on the right side of the screen is a snapshot from community-centric fundraising's aligned actions list. And it's not comprehensive, but it certainly is a great starting point in terms of things that you can do with your fellow nonprofit peers that will also signal to foundations that you can and should be funding us at the same levels and increasing that support, which is huge if the leaderships of the organizations have different racial or demographic backgrounds because of our previous conversation on that. All right. So quick recap is that decision-making refers to some of this internal work we have to do from an equity standpoint, and then this sharing is really about our external work. So getting a bit more actionable with our last little bit of time here. So centering equity, I would venture, and this has been the case for many of my clients, that there was a ton of momentum in 2020 when everyone was home and quarantined, and then things slowed down significantly in 2021. And even more in 2022. And then many folks at the top of this year are scratching their heads on what to do and where to go from here. You may or may not have a DEI statement. It may or may not still make sense to you as an organization. So assuming plans have either stalled, never got off the ground, it is time and necessary for a refresh. And I believe starting with some of these questions might be a different way of approaching that work. The first being, how generous are you with your time as an organization, with your resources, and how transparent are you with your decision-making? Another is, are there peer or grassroots organizations that you can support? Do they know you exist? And do they know you actually as a partner, or do they know you as competition? And how can you rebuild that bridge? And then who do you know in the community? Who inside of a neighborhood association or just a member on a certain block has the community's trust? And how can you uplift the work of that person and their resources for even greater buy-in, not just for your nonprofit, but for the community? So again, for folks who posted a DEI statement in 2020, no, in present time, immediate critique of that in and of itself, but it is worth asking, was the motivation for posting that external or internal? And the actions that were not taken after often lead you to that very clear answer. What level of resources, if any, were allocated, and subsequently so to taking that statement to something that was actually going to be integrated inside of the organization? What voices are missing from your decision-making? Who, if anyone from the community, so outside of your actual nonprofit walls and your volunteer base, is consulted, is aware of how you were trying to serve folks? Are there members of your current community, whether they be staff members or board members or even members of your leadership team, that may delay or intentionally thwart efforts to diversifying decision-making? And if so, what training and resources can be provided, especially once you lay out what type of decision-making tree that you have? So taking stock of where you are, giving grace, perhaps for not getting it right. And I say that in quotations intentionally because there is no perfection inside of this work, and committing to the journey with all of its ebbs and flows and imperfections. So it really is a question of, what are you doing to move the needle when no one is looking? Centering equity from a point of integrating some of this work, many organizations, in my experience, find themselves in a cycle of conversations that may lead to some learning and great reflection, but ultimately go nowhere in terms of changing the fabric of the organization itself. Discussions are great and are absolutely necessary, but they can lead to ambitious declarations like we saw in 2020 that don't lend itself easily to a step one. So while your community focuses on that reflection and learning and mindset shift that may need to happen, or unlearning in many cases of previously accepted truths, any of the action items you see on the screen can serve as key immediate projects for a diverse team of employees who are compensated to focus on. Then when foundations ask you about your DEI work, you ought to be able to share much more about steps you've taken to add a few Black and Brown board members, or reevaluate your curriculum and talk about what you're doing to build equity from the ground up inside. So those include pay equity and attrition audits, harassment and discrimination policies, making sure all of these are updated and regularly reviewed, having an inclusive language guide specific to your community, having a vendor and service provider policy that mandates you have some level of diversity among those that you contract with, training for all on what it looks like to have an inclusive culture. And often that starts with unconscious bias, and then integrating equity into your performance evaluations and reviews. Last but not, we got a couple more before we finish. Keeping in mind as well that equity is not one size fits all. You have to practice and fail along the way. So additional starting points includes identifying your organization's capacity for risk, or what I would call radical truth telling. How performative are your current development operations? Are there existing donor relationships that are harmful? A conversation that has not had nearly enough, especially because most fundraisers at certain levels are women, are the ways in which we are faced with harassment, sexual harassment, and otherwise, inside of our gift solicitation, donor relationships, etc. So consider where you have true friends and allies, and where there may be some foes and folks that you need to invite out of the community, and what that cost would be, both from a financial standpoint, but also from a freedom and liberation standpoint. Another thing to consider is, what is the true cost of your nonprofit operations with quality benefits, competitive wages, potentially a 4-day work week if that's in the realm of your organization, professional development for all, etc. So it's different from just balancing your P&L every year. It's actually making sure you've created a culture where the people doing the work can thrive, and that the community being served is active in what these services and programs look like. My recommendation for any of those existing DEI statements is to make sure they include a focus on cultural humility. So commitments to DEI have to also account for the individual work that we all need to do, including myself, including every other DEI practitioner. We are all still learning and growing, but they need to account and in some way measure and encourage and emphasize and potentially reward self-evaluation, self-learning, self-critique. Everyone is at very different parts of their DEI journeys, especially as it relates to fundraising, decentering whiteness inside of the work, decentering wealth inside of the work, and focusing on all levels of support. So that is a huge step for number 2. And then taking a hard look at the organization itself. And this is not a recommendation to close doors, but having conversations with communities about, are we the right ones to undertake this work? Are we still right to be undertaking this work in this way? Are we having transactional relationships with most members of our community? And how can we change some of that? Specific to your board of directors, again, because there's been such a push to increase the number of increased diversity and representation on the board, make sure you're doing that concurrently with providing training and guidance on maintaining an inclusive culture, building an inclusive culture. The latter cannot exist in a silo. You can certainly diversify and have a huge imbalance of who has power and authority inside of any group. Embracing more values-aligned communications with your donors about your programs, about your services. So it is very easy and tempting for nonprofits to stay apolitical, to stay focused on the work that is not mindful of the entire larger context the nonprofit is existing within. If you are serving Black women, there are specific concerns Black women have. We just celebrated Black Maternal Health Week. Black women carry the most student debt in the country. And the same goes for other communities. Are you thinking about the entire picture, or only the narrow focus of what your nonprofit exists to support? And how can you have a fuller conversation with your donors around that? And that may mean you find that some values are not aligned. And is the cost of that relationship worth not having the community of people that are invested in the way that you would like to see? With staff, leading with transparency, encouraging engagement in decision-making, building a pro-leadership culture. This one is particularly huge because I've been a part of organizations where staff were polled and staff were consulted, and then the decision that the staff thought was going to be made anyway is the one that's still made. And that is quite deeply uninspiring and not motivating. And so making sure that you're encouraging and developing leaders at all levels of the organization so that people don't see the leadership team just as dictators or the board as these mysterious people that show up occasionally and dictate and govern the rest of everyone else's lives. And then having really bold and direct conversations with funders, identifying the right funders to have these conversations with, seeing how actionable they've been with their own DEI strategies, with their own work in the meantime. If they themselves posted a statement and then you don't see any actual change to their work, there are some real hard questions you can ask about where their money is actually invested. Is their money invested in something that is actually harming the community you want to serve? Where does all of their reporting data go? Is there a way that they can invest in data collection in a different, at a different level so that we're really tracking in a meaningful way how close we are to solving some of these social issues instead of looking at every nonprofit's distinct numbers and with a different frame of reference. So these are really just starting points, but the idea is to pick something that you will do in the short term and allow all of these to build to your longer term strategy. I have to end with another quote just because I love and learn from so many great thinkers and academics in the world. This is actually a merger of two, one from Brittany Cooper, who is an incredible professor at Rutgers University and wrote a book that I live by called Eloquent Rage. And she said, be unapologetic about centering those on the margin, which in large measure means decentering yourself. And then you fight for freedom by practicing freedom. I think that these pair really well together. That latter portion is again from Adrian. The word practice is really key because we have to prepare ourselves for an imperfect journey, a very challenging journey, but one that is certainly opening us up to a greater curiosity and learning that our current fundraising structure does not allow. I have my contact information here, but I do think it may be shared along with the slides. I will leave that to the Columbus Foundation team. And then I think we are back to having Danielle join us and lead us through a Q&A.
Thank you so much, April. That was a big and wide presentation. Now is the time for our audience to leave those questions in the Q&A section. We have two here, and I also have a list here of things. I was furiously taking notes while you were talking, but I will lead with the questions in the Q&A section. And we have one that starts with, can you say more about training opportunities to help train board and staff on how to do this? And I want to take a moment to elaborate on this question. The folks in our audience will be looking for ways to grab and apply immediately. And so can you give us some tips on how we can go back to our desks and get started right now?
Absolutely. I love this question. I think it's really important because in my experience, boards exist in quadrants. So I'll talk about boards specifically and staff. Some of these things can directly apply. Boards exist in quadrants. You have a few chunk of folks that are deeply engaged and then it sort of pairs off. You get that 25%, you probably get a donation from. They are not as involved. They may come to a meeting, but it's just not something that they are able to prioritize for various reasons. I think you need to have a focus group inside of your board with those deeply engaged folks to help them understand what it would mean to truly create an inclusive culture on the board. If you have already tried to diversify, if you have added voices and you see that those voices are either potentially being tokenized, if they're not speaking up at all, if you have the same thought of, well, the way we used to do it 10 years ago, then offer some training distinctly to that core group at first so that they can be your advocates and allies as you expose the balance of the board to, this is going to be our new mandate. This is how we're going to operate. We are planning to invite in 5 to 7 grass tops and grassroots leaders to this work. And our decision-making structure is going to change in these ways. And or we're going to try this in a very time-bound way. So I would recommend, as you go back to your desk, breaking this up in quadrants, seeing where you have great buy-in, people that may be a little bit more advanced on their journeys, and helping them build an understanding of what type of culture do we want to have. And that requires being transparent about which voices are we always hearing at every board meeting. And what capacity and what risk can we take if we're going to invite some people? What is the true cost of that? If you're going to lose $25,000 or $15,000, yes, we'll need to make that up, but we also are committed to this other thing. And there's no way to have both of those realities.
Yeah, the only thing I would say is that this kind of feeling safe in doing that can largely start with that board chair, executive director relationship, making sure that you have strength in that relationship, that you can go to that individual and have a discussion with them, have a hard discussion with them, because that's really going to be your advocate inside the boardroom. So I would recommend, and of course, April is the expert on this topic, is starting these conversations with the board chair. All right, so we have another question. Well, it's more of a statement, but I'm going to kind of turn it into a question for us today about the fact that power sharing and the sharing of resources is not really demonstrated anywhere in the workforce in the United States. And so is there some sort of, what is the bridge for us in moving from the current state of, I'm going to call it a scarcity concept, into a place where people share with one another and are encouraged to do so, since our current systems don't necessarily encourage that kind of sharing?
And can you repeat the statement once more so that I fully understand?
Yes. So the statement is around shared power and resources is not really demonstrated anywhere in the United States. So I think this person is saying there's no great examples on how to do that. And I added to that in saying that there is no great, our system doesn't necessarily encourage that kind of sharing. And so what are the ways that we can build a bridge from where we are to that sharing space?
Sure. I would offer and venture that it's perhaps we don't believe it exists or is existing in any format because we're not seeing it done perfectly. I would agree with that statement, that we're not seeing examples of this being done in a perfect, buttoned up, excellent, successful way all the time. But there are organizations that are trying this. There are organizations that have flattened their hierarchy. There are organizations that have found ways to bring in community voice. There are foundations that have found ways to bring in community voice. They certainly exist, and I don't have a current list, but that work is there. I believe Bridgespan did some work on sharing decision-making power and centering people with lived experience. And inside of that article, there are a number of organizations, nonprofit think tanks, schools, et cetera, that have tried this. And so one of the things, and it's my belief, that what hems us up is thinking that power sharing is something that we can checklist, much like we approach the rest of our DEI initiatives. You are likely not to get it right the first time, maybe even the second time. It's going to be bumpy, but there is value in that journey. And so I would agree with your statement as well, Danielle, that it's not encouraged. It's not encouraged by the corporate sector. It's not encouraged in government, like absolutely not. But I think nonprofits, and that part of the reason I love this sector is because we're uniquely positioned. And I want nonprofits to exist and thrive because we're not government and because we're not corporate and because we do have the flexibility and range to engage with the community in different ways. And so that means sometimes charting your own course. It means reaching out to people that have tried things and preparing yourself and your team to fail for the sake of trying to get it right. So I think I'm just going to push a bit on the premise and mindset of the statement because it is hard. And there's not a team that I think you'll find that says we've achieved it and we've achieved it in perpetuity. There are folks that are definitely trying and committed to the journey, though.
So you're saying that this is an evolution and that you have to start somewhere and that you're never at a place where you can say that you've arrived. You are at a place that you can say you are on the path, though. And so looking for others who are also on the path that we can learn from.
Community needs change. Community leaders change. Resources shift. And so it's not a stagnant journey in which you did in 2020 even is going to apply inside of what you did in 2023. So it's a matter of how do you build this into your annual framework of, Are we talking to the right people still? Is there additional buy-in from a generational level, et cetera? But your summation, I would say, is definitely accurate. That trying to start at a place where you're saying we're going to achieve all of this right now is setting yourself up for something that doesn't exist.
Okay. So we have another question here in the box that I think is a great one, and likely one that many of the folks in our audience have, and I'm sure in general have. So what guidance do you offer on organizations that have a heavy reliance on high net worth individual donors that may present a challenge to the organization shifting its power sharing and resource sharing practices?
Thank you for allowing me to sip some water. High net worth donors. I started, and I forget exactly what slide it was on, by saying determining what your capacity for risk is, right? I think I would be a pretty awful consultant and human being if I was to say, cut them all off today. I don't think that's a realistic approach. If you can account for how much money these folks are bringing in, and build yourself a pipeline to earn that money somewhere else before you start to have conversations where your values and your approaches to equity and inclusion are much more at the forefront of your conversation, whereas you have the capacity, you're willing to take the risk to sever potentially that relationship. And this is not done in such a way where it's saying, hey, Danielle, your values suck and you're not good enough for us. We're over here revolting. It's not done that way. You can simply just have a value misalignment, and then they no longer are the best donor for you. But I wouldn't start with saying, you all have to go. Do some work to figure out what exact resources are we talking about. And if you don't have the capacity, if you don't have the pipeline to account for those additional funds, then maybe your approach has to be much softer. Maybe you do try and educate some people. Maybe you do work to change hearts and minds, which is an entirely different journey. But my recommendation would never be, because I think many nonprofits would fall to the wayside if they were just to discount everyone who's giving them 6 figures, 7 figures a year, where there very likely are some deep-rooted beliefs that are not shared across the board. I think one thing all nonprofits can do, and one thing obviously grassroots organizations have a much easier time doing, is speaking about what is political, is speaking about the entire context and some of the more radical issues in ways that nonprofits with larger budgets tend not to be able to, especially if your donors are not values aligned. But if you are part of a team, if there's buy-in from decision makers, from the board, from the staff, that we want to build a values aligned community, they're getting real about what that risk is, making sure there's enough of a cushion before you start to approach, and being very direct with that. And if that is not the right time for this, being honest and gracious with yourselves about that too.
If I may just add to that wonderful explanation, that I don't think that we should make an assumption that we already know what our donors are thinking or how they might react to certain messages. In the conversations around community-centric fundraising, or introducing a more equity-based framework in fundraising, an assumption tends to be made around how people will react without having tested that assumption. And so I would certainly encourage you to start testing out your messaging before deciding that it's not something that can be introduced.
Can I add to that quickly, Danielle? Because at this event where I was yesterday, where a woman leaned over and said, so tell me why development officers are moving around so much. And it was because of another piece of the conversation that had already taken place. But she also leaned over to me at the end and said, what is equity? Now, mind you, my colleague or my client had been speaking for about 25 minutes at that point on gender inequity and gender justice. And she got through the entire presentation. She asked a question of my colleague about something else. And by the end of it, she still didn't know what we were talking about. And so to whatever extent you can take some of this jargon and throw it to the wayside, it's been so overused, it's been so misunderstood that it's not entirely helpful. But what is a concise statement you can say about the community that you're serving? We want the trans community to do X or to have X. We want young Black boys in this country to not get shot when they walk up to their neighbor's door. All of those things. So what is the core of it? What does it look like without the DEI jargon on top? I think that's appropriate for some audiences, but not all.
You know, that's really, I think, an important call out around language accessibility and kind of knowing the folks that you will be talking to and talking to the issue as opposed to the jargon that's typically around the issue. I mean, because at the center of these conversations are humans. And so if we can just get to that piece, that is where we'll likely connect the most with others. So I have a couple of questions for you. One is around, you mentioned, and I wrote it down as a quote and possibly butchered it. So you have to practice and fail along the way. And I think that this aversion to failure is what stops a lot of organizations in their tracks across the nonprofit landscape. So we're talking about funders and other types of nonprofits being afraid to make a step or a leap. I'm going to even say baby steps because of the fear of failure. Can you talk about how we can overcome that?
I love this question. Thank you. There's much to be said about perfectionism, both as we experience it as individuals, but then also as we experience it inside of the sector distinctly. In large measure, foundations, and this is a generalization, but there's a ton of evidence to support it, are asking nonprofits to perform perfection, right? So to still present them with something, you can be really detailed and specific about what your need is, but is there space to talk about the balance of your organization's culture? Is there space to talk about how wages haven't been increased beyond 3% in however many years? Is there space to talk about the challenges we're really having with X, Y, and Z, retaining the right people, recruiting the right people? And so perfectionism is in some ways reinforced by this power imbalance, but it's also something that many of us just individually carry. And for my white brethren and sisterin, this idea of being an ally means you say the right thing. This idea of being an ally or an actionable ally means you get it right. No, not really. It's this that you're willing to make the sacrifice and lead with curiosity and acknowledge that you still have a ton to learn. There is so much value in that. And then just exposing yourself to a challenge, to a critique, to a growth opportunity, instead of saying, well, I read White Fragility and I have the answers. Not quite, right? So this practice and failure is really leading from a place that I need to be curious about what this world looks like without centering myself, what this work looks like without centering the experience and the network that I have, and offer that framing. No one likes to fail, and fundraisers especially do not like to fail. I am a fundraiser, have been. That you just have a competitive nature to you. You see a goal, you're going to achieve it by any means necessary. And then also we have to acknowledge how harmful that is on our individual selves, hence why there is a ton of turnover, and for the community at large. So would we linger more if there was a more values aligned approach to the work? Would we linger a little bit longer if we felt like we could have some more liberation and conversations around the community in a different way? I would venture so, but considering it all a practice, right? And the challenge with the way that we've been presented some of DEI is something that you can achieve. You might diversify your board in 1 year and then have to start from scratch in the following. But we really want to get it one and done because we've existed inside of so many cyclical conversations about it versus committing to the work over and over again, especially when no one is looking and when no one's talking about it in the mainstream.
So we have some folks in the chat that are celebrating you, and I wanted to share that. We had a person say, excellent presentation, and we have someone celebrating you with emojis right now.
I'll take that.
And we have a person saying, thank you for the wonderful presentation. It's given a lot of tangible steps to take away. So before we wrap up, I still have a couple more questions. One of the things that I just want to highlight that you continue to do is you talk about DEI and you talk about the equity piece of this, but you never allow us to lose sight of how this wraps into just being a human and what this means for basic wages of employment and what your work environment means and how all of this is connected. And so I think it's important for us to talk about the basic employment structure of a nonprofit and how that leans into equity. Can you talk a little bit about that for me?
Absolutely. And thanks to everyone that had kind things to say. And those of you that didn't, love you too. But specific to equity as a much more comprehensive conversation, to me, it's so critical. I think maybe inclusive in the presentation and beyond, because when we say a lot of these terms, what people are really thinking is like, okay, where are the Black people in this? Where are the brown people? Like there has to be some color in the group. And that's really not the conversation I want to have, right? People that are underpaid at nonprofits in general, like regardless of your race, your wages are going to be too low and not competitive, and your benefits are likely to not be great, but you're there for a particular reason. So because we want to be there, how can we as fundraisers make sure that we're celebrating the people that are taking the sacrifice and cut because they believe in this mission? I've ventured a little bit away from your question, but I do think that looking at equity in this more comprehensive way of we all individually have something to share, right? We all individually have something that we need to learn and disavow and maybe atone for. And what a lot of nonprofits are also missing is this atonement for. If you've had a completely homogenous board from a racial perspective or a socioeconomic perspective, and the same with your staff, for as long as you've been around, there could be some people that are giving you the side eye. You might need to start from a place of atonement and reconciliation and restoring some of that, which is all rooted in equity. And I think the reality is we're doing a lot more things that we could put under this umbrella, but because it doesn't check a box or because it's not specific to what people think equity is, they discount it. Even having the conversation, even venturing to sort of make this statement inside of a board meeting, all of this is in service to getting somewhere else and shifting and disrupting what we currently have. And again, it's not that what we currently have needs to entirely be thrown to the wayside, but we do have to be much more accountable for what is not working and save ourselves some of that strife and performance of saying, no, this is great, this is perfect. If it was, we would stick around 1 or 2 years.
Yeah, that reminds me a little bit of a book called The Sum of Us by Heather McGhee that really talked about how moving in the direction of equity of all kinds is a benefit for an entire group of people. It will improve the overall workplace for everyone employed there. That is the business case for diving into this work headfirst. That is the business case. So I would encourage everybody to pick that up as well. If you have a board to convince, that might be a great read. So I actually am wondering if you could tell us a little bit about, if we could go back to decision-making sharing and that piece. I'm wondering if you could give us an example around what this looks like in practice. So if an organization is doing this well, what does it look like?
Yeah, and I may have rushed through this. Thank you for asking, for giving us more time. I may have rushed through this inside of the presentation. One of my clients is an organization in California, and they have about a $6 to $8 million budget a year. They host an annual event for lawyers, essentially. They've done incredible work to diversify that audience in the past year. I have to say they've come a very long way. It is not just the lawyers convening year after year, lawyers with very robust, rich salaries. At that event, there's a silent auction or there's a raffle in which they give the proceeds to one of their legal aid partners. So they're sharing what they know their legal aid partners do not have access to, and quite frankly, do not strive to. Legal aid organizations are maybe not in the mindset, or the particular partner that they have, let me not generalize, of planning an annual event at a very nice venue. Some may, but this particular partner isn't. But they know that giving $7,000 or $8,000 of what they raised that night is not only elevating the profile of their partner, but supporting their partner's work. And so to me, that sharing of that resources. I've also seen some of my clients as they bring in consultants to help them on community-centric fundraising or something else, invite some of their peers to that so that it's not just for their own singular development team, right? If a team wants to know more, then not only keeping those resources for themselves. Actually, our affiliate over here, they can't budget for this as of yet, so how can we open the door? There's this deep-seated competition that many of us, and I think most, I would venture, I don't know, have by virtue of being inside of a nonprofit. I have to raise money for me. Well, if my peer over here wins, then I win as well. And so telling that from a different story, that our nonprofits should be uniquely positioned to do a singular thing, have a particular intervention. If someone is replicating that in a different community, that is a friend, not a competitor, right? What we should be focused on, I would venture, is who's leading these organizations, and are they getting the same level of support from foundations? Because oftentimes that's the data that's really going to drive you a little bit insane. If you have a boys and girls clubs over here that has a white ED, and then one over here in a different community that has a black ED, they're likely getting very different levels of support for doing the same or very similar work. And so how can we sort of bridge that? Hey, funder, might you consider funding both of us at this level? So someone in that position of power who that has that access, taking that leap to have that conversation. I think that's probably sufficient. Let me know if not.
Actually, I'm glad you stopped there, because that's something that piqued my interest during this conversation. And I wondered what that looked like for you on the nonprofit side, that sort of, I'm going to call it collaboration, but I think collegiality among nonprofits, and how in a I would say system in general in life that does force us to think about ourselves as opposed to thinking about the larger community. How does one nonprofit reach out to another nonprofit? How do we bridge that scarcity feeling, I'm going to call it? Because it sounds like what you're saying is that it's more of a feeling than a reality. It's not super real.
I would say so. It definitely depends on the individuals occupying the seat, though. Like, I'm not going to venture that every time you pick up the phone, you'll get a receptive, warm welcome. It could be, no, you're not a priority for me. But I have coached clients through, okay, we're seeing that all of our most funders supporting immigration are based in California. We happen to be based over here in New Jersey or New York. Let's pick up the phone and call those people to see if they have a similar service that we do, see if there's a path to learn from what their approach is, if what we do can be replicated there, and potentially be an opportunity for us to partner, and at a very minimum expose ourselves to this group of people that is still doing great work, but is only tangentially related to how we operate. And so approaching it from that standpoint, sometimes it's not for a lack of funding. It could be because of your region. It could be because funders have focused on a different element of it and not the framework that you have. And so I have seen great partnerships evolve. I think people often don't give credit as well to how challenging ED positions are, and quite frankly, how lonely a lot of nonprofit EDs are. And if there are any of you on here that are EDs, call me, I understand. But it is a very tight and tough position to be in. But that's why I made note of Ann Price and her journey out in California, because she was an ED that was doing incredible work, Danielle. I cannot begin to explain how incredible her work was, and getting paid 60% of her predecessor's salary, and eventually resigned because the board still would not increase her despite doubling the philanthropic revenue, despite having incredible outcomes, and the staff resigned with her. So there are many ways her nonprofit peers, in addition to not just the staff, can show up and have showed up to support her, because it was outrageous. And so making sure that we're all calling attention to where there is bad behavior, right? Where there just might happen to be a group of board members that are averse to change, and then making sure you sort of rally and build support among the community that does see and appreciate your work.
Thank you for that. I have one more question that I'm still formulating the question for it, but the thing that you called out around diversity, which can exist while still having inequity within an organization. So we, my background is in program measurement, so outcomes measurement. You tag a metric of increasing diversity, but you do not necessarily measure another metric of increasing power. And so you don't see that this power sharing is not happening. You just see that you've increased diversity and you've called it a win. I think because we're all sort of entering this realm at the same time, in large measure because of the events of 2020, we started out measuring diversity. What does diversity look like? How can we make a transition to measuring everything else you've talked about, sharing? And what does that measurement look like? Is there a measurement for that?
Absolutely. So much to say. Have a part two. I post 2020, and I'm just going to also take this moment to say, when we're saying 2020, we are referring to the very unfortunate and unnecessary murder of George Floyd, and how that has now become a moment in time for people having to reckon or not reckon with race relations. So I just want to call that out so that we're all clear. And I was cringing and felt terrible when I saw a series of like nonprofit emails on different listservs of how to diversify your donor pipeline and how to diversify your board. Because I'm like, how is that the first immediate step for asking Black and Brown people to give more, and already giving to the tune of like $11 billion a year and do additional like free labor? That to me was just so not the starting point. And I was like, you're going to tokenize these people. You're going to get them in there so that you can have that metric. And then are they going to have a voice? Or are you just inviting that person to speak on behalf of all Black people because your actual current board doesn't want to do the learning, hasn't been presented the opportunity to learn and reflect and self-critique? You haven't invited a theory or a notion of cultural humility before you've done that. So to me, no, don't delay in diversifying, but make sure you're doing a lot of that concurrently, because there is a different behavior and culture that you have to have when you have more representation around the table. And it is about power sharing. So that transition to me means that the metric looks different. You're measuring culture, you're measuring safety, which I think is something that you brought up earlier. You're measuring access to decision makers, right? Are EDs meeting with all board members, or are they meeting with the board members that give them $75,000 a year? So it's a different question. It's not just a metric. And I personally, maybe because I'm a consultant, but I did this even in-house, love asking foundations the same questions they asked me. How diverse is your board? How diverse is your board? What have you done to change your decision-making process? How are you evaluating yourself on these very things you're asking of us? But diversity is a great first step. And the last thing, but it's not the only step. The last thing that I'll say about this is I was in a conversation with very large foundation, just say one of the largest here in our nation. If you think about some of the wealthiest people, very large foundation. And the questions that myself and the other consultant were going to be asked to solve for was, is our focus on diversity helping? And I struggled so much even inside of that conversation because it was the wrong question. It was sort of like, you're asking me about the numbers game, like you're asking me about if I can prove that their focus on diversity has achieved something. And they weren't even in a place to move to equity, but they've been throwing diversity around for 10 plus years. And so that is a whole different can of paint when you think that, again, to the credit or challenge or critique of how DEI has been presented, it certainly was not intended to harm and confuse, but people harped on to one word and then think that solves everything. You can have representation and still not have inclusion. You can have diversity and be nowhere close to equity.
So we have a comment that is, again, celebrating your greatness. They respect your directness. It's not at all rude, and it's just a reality of the place that we're in. So we're all really celebrating that you've come here to be so honest. It's much appreciated, certainly. And I think that you are emphasizing for us today that diversity is day one of our lifelong journey on the path of equity. It is day one, and we have a whole lifelong opportunity and responsibility to create safe places for people to be employed and for people to give of their time and to benefit of the services. So thank you so much for highlighting these for us. This really felt a lot like a 1.0 in that we may need to have further conversations about this. I'm grateful for the energy that you brought today. Thank you for everybody joining us as well. Thank you for spending your time with us. Please keep an eye on both the inbox that you use to register for this forum. And also stick around for a few seconds after this is over to fill out the survey that lets us know how we did when we invited April here today and when we have done all of our forums up to this point. We would love to hear from you. Thank you so much and have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you, everyone.